Hi, I'm Gordon Harris, and today we're going to go for a walk a little closer to town. As a matter of fact, we're starting right here at the Ipswich Bed and Breakfast, which is at the intersection of North Main, East, and High Streets. And we're going to talk about just a few houses on our way because we're really going to go up Spring Street. We're going to explore some interesting little things I've seen when I take my walks up the hill. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this house because this was the home of Captain James Stanford, and he actually, as many people did in Ipswich at back in the 1700s, had a couple of enslaved persons that worked for him. They're part of the story as we walk up the hill. So this isn't the house where Captain James Stanford lived. This was the location of this house. Then we're going to walk on up down East Street to the place where Arthur Wesley Dow was born. I'm standing in front of the Captain Matthew Perkins house, and it's one of the finest first period houses in Ipswich. Something that you'll notice about this house, it has these overhangs. You see it on the front, and you see it on the side. This was actually a fashion that occurred between about 1680 and 1710, that for a while we were interested in going back to the post-medieval style of architecture that the ancestors of the settlers of Ipswich had grown up with. It was a very short revival period. The reason I stopped at this house, other than that I'm an architecture and history nerd, is that this was the birthplace of Arthur Wesley Dow. He was a very influential artist in American history. He was born in Ipswich in this house, and as we walk up Spring Street, we're going to see where he grew up as well. Let's go on down the street. Since I am a house and history nerd, let's stop by a couple of more houses along the way. This is called the Baker House, and you notice it's not the size of the big, larger hall and parlor houses that we see in Ipswich. It's what's called a half house, and a young man might build a home. This is a 1725 house, and then as his family got larger, he became more successful. He would build the other side of the house, and you would have the house with the central chimney. There's another one close by, and then we're going to walk on down the street to the corner. This is the other half house I was talking about, and many of these houses on East Street have preservation agreements with the Ipswich Historical Commission. You notice again the date 1725, and that's a really transitional date when we talk about first period and the later Georgian type of architecture. One of the things you see on some of these houses that we saw on the other house is a little Beverly jog, this little stairway on the outside, because sometimes families would continue to live with each other for generations. So the next house along our way here will be the father of Captain Stanford, John Stanford. This is another great old house in Ipswich. It actually, part of it dates back to 1687, and I misspoke. This is actually Captain James Stanford's Captain James Stanford's grandfather's house, and it was built in 1687, so it's a lot earlier. Probably again, the left side or the right side was built first. It has a name, the Polydole House, and nobody knows who Polydole was, but it's actually known in Ipswich as the home of John Updike when he lived in Ipswich, and he lived here for about 30 years and wrote many of his books here. So here we are at the corner of Spring Street and East Street and County Street. This is now an empty lot. It once had a house here before the road was widened a little bit. The signs behind us point up the hill to where we're going to go, the Daniel Boone Park, and also the Dow's Park. It's a nice trail out to a little memorial for Arthur Wesley Dow, so that explains why I stopped by his house. There's also a small memorial here for Captain Arthur Hardy. He was the young man who served in the Vietnam War, and his plane was shot down. For a number of years, he was missing. His body was missing in action, and eventually was brought back, and he's buried at the Highland Cemetery. Now, another thing about this location is just up the hill, just very slightly, was the home of the two enslaved persons, Peter and James Freeman, who were, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this little talk, were enslaved by Captain James Staniford. So towards the end of that period when they were enslaved, they bought a small lot right at the corner of this empty space here and built a little house. Eventually their son John Freeman fought in the Revolutionary War, and we're not sure exactly when they were manumitted. That means when they were freed as slaves, but the entire family after the Revolutionary War moved up to Maine and joined a community of other formerly enslaved Black Americans who had established themselves there. So let's walk up this street. Now this is called Spring Street now, but it was called Brook Street earlier on, and basically the same meaning. One of the reasons is that there are brooks running down the hill, and there's a house immediately across the street here that was originally built as a fulling mill. A fulling mill is a small operation where they clean and straighten out the fibers of wool. It was this house here. It was built by a man named Stanwood. His operation didn't last very long, but after the Revolutionary War and especially after the War of 1812, we had to begin cleaning and preparing wool ourselves instead of importing it from England. And it was pretty, it was a rather convenient location, because up the hill where we're going to head, that's where the sheep grazed early on in the Ipswich history. Corner, just up the street, the corner of Highland with Spring Street, and this is a really steep hill. This is one place I go when I don't want to get out in the snow and muck around. I like to walk up Spring Street. Sometimes I'll take that very steep walk up Highland. The little red house behind us, this was one of the many small schools in Ipswich, Highland School, and now it's a private residence. So I mentioned that there were springs on Spring Street, or Brook Street as it was known back in the day, and so we're just heading up the hill, and you can see here, this is one of the springs. It drops into a culvert here, and for the rest of the way it runs down the road. But if you're standing over any of these culverts going down County Street, you'll hear that rushing spring. Now, there's a little history to what happened. I mentioned the fulling mill, where they worked with the wool, and the spring ran right through that property at the corner of Summer and Spring Street. So it was about early 1850s that the town decided to build the County Street Bridge. There was no bridge there before. There was only the choke bridge. So they built the bridge, but they needed water because there was actually a lot of factories right there at that intersection. So they made an arrangement with Mr. Stanwood, who had the fulling mill, to use the water that was running through his property. He sold them the rights to that, and but he did have one condition. He said that he get running water in his house. So that's thought to be the first house in Ipswich that actually had running water, and it came from right here. But I'm going to show you the little spring where this water is coming from. Just off of Spring Street on the left, this little private driveway, and as you just step in just a few feet, right here, there's a little bank. And you look down below, there's the reservoir. It's the first of several, reservoirs that were built on this hillside to catch water from the spring, which runs just across this driveway here. So before we get to that spring, this is the childhood home of Arthur Wesley Dow. As I mentioned, he was born in the Matthew Perkins house, but his family built this house here, and this is where he grew up. As a young man, he went to France, studied art, became very involved with the Impressionist movement, came back here, and then he purchased the house that's called the Howard House at the intersection of Turkey Shore and Green Street, and had a summer art school. So this was his home, and if you look back in here, there is another spring that comes down the hill, and it's circulating all the time. I don't really know the history of that particular spring, but what we're going to do is just walk around the corner here, and and you can see the first little reservoir where they collected water probably for several houses in Ipswich, as our first running water. People who grew up in Ipswich know this as the Moseley estate. The Moseley family owned it, and they were members of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. At one time there were beautiful gardens everywhere. Of course, they take a lot of effort to maintain, but it's still a rather impressive property up here, about halfway up Spring Street. The next thing I want to show you is something very unusual here on the Moseley estate. And what we're standing in front of, you can see in the distance here, it's a really unusual circle of trees. Now, people in Ipswich always like to talk about witches and things like that. I've heard people call it the witch's circle. Well, actually the story on these trees appears to be something actually even more interesting. I did sort of sneak in there one day, and they appear to be redwoods by the bark and by the leaves. And of course, redwoods, when you plant them on the East Coast, they grow much shorter. There's something that redwoods do that I don't know if any other evergreen tree does, and that is when you plant a redwood, and that as it ages out or dies, something about that dying process, it sends out energy through the roots, and these burls on the roots sprout up branches, and they create a circle all around the former tree of small redwoods. Now, this one has been maintained very well, and if we were to go in, which we can't do because it is private property, you would see that it's been maintained as concentric circles of redwoods, and so I understand it's like a spiral, and as when you walk into the spiral, there is the empty space in the middle where the first redwood that was planted there died. Now, it's such an unusual thing. I haven't heard about it anywhere else. Here on the West Coast, it's very common for redwoods to do this. Sometimes they call them fairy circles of redwoods, like the little fairy circles that mushrooms do. But I haven't seen anything like that here, but that's what I think it is. Well, we've gone over the crest on Spring Street, and just as you start to go down, you have a lot of choices here. It's a fork. Now, there are two private residences on the right-hand side with driveways, and over here, this takes you up to Daniel Boone Park, which we're going to visit. But first, let's go down. There's a little path that takes us to a memorial stone that was erected for Arthur Wesley Dow. His art studio was down this little road, and then it had it looked over the marshes. It looked out towards Crane Beach, and he referred to it as Bayberry Hill. So if you take this little path road here, there's a sign, and then the path goes right off to the right. And this is the entrance to the trail. It's a little distance. We're going to go to the memorial. I was here just a few days ago, and it was covered with that kind of crunchy, hard, icy snow. But this is a perfect day. It's, you know, the clouds are coming out, but the snow quickly melted away. So let's go. So somewhere in here, and it seems that nobody can remember exactly where it was, there was an observation tower during World War II where the Ipswich Home Guard could look out over the river out towards the bay, and keeping an eye out for German submarines. If you think that sounds like maybe that would never have happened, it did happen. There were German submarines spotted off the coast, close to Crane Beach. There's an old stone wall. Why are there stone walls all over New England? Well, it's because the soil was just full of it, and when the settlers got here, one of the first things they had to do was clear those rocks away to try to grow, their crops. You know, they quickly discovered this wasn't the best place to be a farmer. We did have farms up into the 19th century, and there's just a few still left today. But there are these beautiful stone walls. You can look down this one here that show where they divided land. And sometimes it was just really just to get the rocks. You got to put them somewhere if you want to raise your cattle, if you want to grow a crop. We're almost to the memorial, and the house that you see over here is a private residence, but it's on the location where Arthur Wesley Dow's studio was. Unfortunately, the studio burned down. So we made it. This is the end of the little Dow Trail, and this is the bronze plaque that memorializes him set into the stone. So why is Arthur Wesley Dow so important? Well, you know, he brought the Impressionist movement here in his unique form to America, and he was a professor of art at universities. His book about composition is still in print. It's still used even today. If you would like to see some of his work, first of all, the Ipswich Museum has a nice collection of Dow paintings. He's also was involved in photography, so he made prints that we call cyanotypes, and I was fortunate to receive a collection of these to put on my site, historicipswich.org. But the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a wonderful collection, online collection that you can look at to do those cyanotypes. When he died, his widow bequeathed this land to the town of Ipswich, and that's why we had this nice memorial. We made it back from the Dow Trail, and we're back at that intersection where we went down the hill. Now we're going to go up the hill. This is called the Daniel Boone Park. It's not the Daniel Boone that you read about when you were a child in Ipswich in American history. Reverend Daniel Boone was a minister of the Episcopal Church here in Ipswich for many, many years, and was very involved in civic affairs, a great man, and when they commemorated him by naming the park after him. We're at Baker's Pond, and so many people that grew up in Ipswich tell me that they used to skate up here in the winter. Well, here it is, March, and the pond has been pretty much without ice all winter long. Now, I was up here a week or two ago and had a little skim of ice, but you can see in the ice where the springs are, because springs, this is a spring-fed pond, and they come up in the pond and they tend to spread out. You'll see sort of a weak circle in the ice, a darker spot, and little filaments of that spring in the ice. You don't want to go out on this pond. Now, climate change has made a huge difference in this pond. I don't think there's any time, especially this year or most years, that it would be safe to go out here. But it's a beautiful pond, and we have a nice little trail to go on. Nice little field of cattails here. When I was in my 20s, I spent a summer living off the land, and so when the cattails are green, before they turn brown and fluffy, the cattails themselves can be steamed, and they're edible, and it's not, as far as I know, they're non-poisonous. But also the roots. Now the roots are edible, but getting those roots out of the muck, I never tried that. So we're at a little fork in the path, and not completely around the pond yet, but this little path here will take you over to the upper part of Highland Cemetery. So if you're doing this walk, you have a choice here of either continuing on around, as we're going to do today, or you can go right through here, walk through the cemetery, and then down to the Old North Cemetery, and you're on High Street, and you can head back to where you started. Then up here, just past Baker's Pond, is a reservoir. So this was the first reservoir that the town built in 1894. You know, what happened was we talked about having a water supply system for many years, and they knew that they would be using the brooks out on Dow Brook and Bull Brook, but there was a lot of objection. People didn't want to spend the money. The farmers were concerned that that the brooks would be drained dry and their cattle wouldn't, or the crops wouldn't have enough water. But what happened was, in January of 1894, it was a really cold day. It was like 20 or 30 degrees below zero, and Central Street, which was actually really quite new, only a few decades old, caught on fire all the way from the corner where Heart and Soul is now, almost down to Hammond Street. Every building on that side of the street burned. And they held, they put it out. All we had was these hand pumpers, and we had various cisterns around town, but everything froze up. And if it hadn't been that the Ipswich stocking mill had some more modern water equipment there and hoses, which they ran to the fire, they brought all the way over to the corner. It's no telling how much of Ipswich would have burned down. But yet we had a town meeting, and yet again the town voted not to put in a water system. Well, just a few months later, that same year, the other end of town, where the Depot Square is, that's right across from the Institution for Savings, was a building called the Damon Building. And it caught on fire and burned down again, in a very cold weather. So this time, the town of Ipswich wisely voted to put in a water system. When they did, they created the large reservoirs that we see today over on Upper High Street and ran the pipes. Some of those pipes are actually still in the roads today and are still in use. They ran them here. And the first reservoir, because what you want to do is pump the water to a reservoir or a tank and then let that be where the gravity feed happens. So we're going to go right here, and you can see the edge of the reservoir. It abuts right on the side of Baker's Pond. So these are the granite steps that take you up to that reservoir. Excuse me, I spoke to Vicki Hellman with the water department about this. He said this reservoir is no longer, of course, in use. But it is still here, and they still maintain it, so it does, so it doesn't break. Let's just walk up, take a look. Actually has a nice little trail that goes around it, and it's a little grown up right now, so we won't go through it. But it's still in pretty good shape. Over here on the right through the woods there, that's where your water comes from if you live in Ipswich and you have town water. I think it's a metal tank, and this year and a couple of years ago, it was decided that it was beyond repair, and the town constructed a new tank, which we see here. It's not online yet, but Vicki told me that after it is put online and everything is finished with the work, that the old tank will be deconstructed and we'll be using this new tank instead. We've been walking around the Baker's Pond and around the reservoir. Then, of course, there was the water tank here. And if you want to then continue back down the hill, just finish the circle, and you'll be back to where the gate is, and you can walk back down Spring Street, which we're going to do later. But for right now, let's walk down this hill. This is a pretty steep slope that goes down to the sewage treatment plant on Fowler Lane. And there's a little trail off to the left that takes you to the Immigrant Cemetery. So follow me. That remarkable view that Arthur Wesley Dow painted from his studio, which was just over there where we walked. And you're looking across, you can see the wind turbines. There's 2 wind turbines there. Looking across, you're looking at Rowley, and the ocean is just beyond. If you continue down this trail, there's a little fork to the left, and that's where we're going to go visit what's called the Highland Annex Cemetery, but locally it's referred to as the Immigrant Cemetery. So, we're close to the fork, where we're going to go down to the Immigrant Cemetery, but this is an outstanding view, and you can see some interesting things. First of all, if you ever wonder about where does all the sewage go, that's it. That's our sewer treatment plant, and I understand it's ready for an upgrade, so we're going to see some changes. That's at the end of Fowler's Lane, which comes off of Town Farm Road, and there's also the animal shelter is down there. Beyond it, you can see something, and that's where, you know, you can see the white. That's all the boats that are wrapped in plastic wrap. I believe that boatyard is probably off of Town Farm Road. What we're going to do now is take this little trail here, just off to the left, down to the cemetery. This is the trail entrance to the Immigrant Cemetery. A little history on this. You know, up to the middle of the 19th century, Ipswich was populated very much by people whose ancestors had grown up in this town. It was very much an Anglo town, with, you know, descendants of the early settlers being the larger part of the population. But Ipswich fell into a lot of poverty between the time of the War of 1812 and the Industrial Revolution. And then something really interesting happened. We opened the Ipswich Mill. First it was a woolen mill, and then Amos Lawrence enlarged it. We had the Ipswich Hosiery Mill, became the largest hosiery company in the world. It was located right here in Ipswich, and it's now the EBSCO Publishing Buildings. So the population of the Ipswich doubled within just a few decades, and much of that were people coming from Europe to work in our mills. There were Polish, Greek workers. There were also French Canadians. There were some, before that, there were young farm girls who came to work in the factories here. And so it was actually said that around 1900 that you could walk down Market Street and half of the people talking, you wouldn't understand the language that they're speaking. The wonderful thing is that these populations who came to work here and the mill became assimilated in the town, became prominent and important individuals in our community today. But that was not the case in 1913 when there was a strike at the Ipswich hosiery mill. They went on strike because the locally born workers were being paid much more than they were for the very same labor, and they were just asking for a small pay raise. The strike went on for months and months. And eventually there was a confrontation. The police were called in from different towns, and the police fired shots into in the direction of the crowd. They claimed that the crowd shot at them first, but that was never shown to be the case. And it was a poor young Greek woman who's commemorated here, who was killed by that fire. So the Ipswich hosiery mills did close a decade or so later, and then Sylvania came, and now that whole facility is EBSCO Publishing. So many of these are going to remain unknown exactly who was buried at which location. However, the cemetery department has an inventory of the graves, or at least a partial inventory of who was buried here, and I do have a list of those names with photographs of some of these gravestones on my site, historicipswich.org. So this plaque was put here by the Ipswich Historical Society and the Department of Ipswich Parks and Cemetery Department in 2009, and they do a great job of maintaining the sign. Not many people know this spot. It's a very quiet spot. This is Fowler's Lane that we mentioned earlier on. Back behind us is Town Farm Road, and indeed there was a town farm at the end of the road where in the early 1800s up till the early 20th century, poor people, if they didn't have a family to take care of them, they were sent out to the town farm. At that location, if you were to go all the way down Town Farm Road today, is where our transfer station is, and where those two wind turbines that we spotted also are. A little bit of history. That in the 1960s, it was proposed to put a nuclear power plant where the turbines and the transfer station are, and people in this town rose up in opposition to it. It was really a crazy plan. They were going to dump the water first. First plan was just to dump the water in the clam beds, which of course the hot water would have killed the clams. Eventually they came up with a really crazy idea to put a huge pipe underneath Plum Island and dump the hot water several miles out into the ocean. But the plan was defeated, and then in the 1980s, the plant was built at Seabrook, where the Seabrook nuclear power plant is today. Now, before we end our little tour here today, I want to show you a spot where it's very fond in the memories of people who grew up in this town of Ipswich. It's called Second Sands. So there's one thing that I want to mention as we're leaving the Immigrant Cemetery here. I didn't grow up in Ipswich, but kids in this town, people who are my age now, grew up playing at a place called Second Sands, and they talk about it all the time. And it's interesting that maybe they're trying to hide it from me where it was, but when you ask people, well, where is the Second Sands, this wonderful place? All the kids in town were playing there. It's right next to the Immigrant Cemetery, and it's this sort of like sand dunes that you wouldn't expect there at that location. And they would go and just play in the sand. Apparently a lot. They had to go over the hill that we just went over. So I've gone and looked for it, and maybe someone who's watching this today can help me out. But it appears to me that this overgrown place right next to the Immigrant Cemetery was what they call Second Sands. Now, well, it's a patch of Japanese knotweed and other kinds of plants like that. So I don't know, kids play in different places today, but that's just another piece of history of the Immigrant Cemetery. Well, we're back just about to where we started, heading up the hill. We're here on Spring Street, and you look up the hill. It's a pretty nice incline. But something I didn't mention when we started out our little walk going up the hill is that when the first settlers got here to Ipswich, that was way back in 1633, this was actually the Native Americans' path up to the Merrimack, up to what we call Newburyport today. And you wonder, well, why didn't they just go on our high street, modern 1A 133? And that's because that's all a wetland. When you're driving there close to Shaw's, look on either side and you'll see this, it's a marshy area, and the road was raised and put into the marsh. So this was one of two Native American paths I know. This one went up to the Merrimack, and then Washington Street, which connected to Lime Brook, and that took you over to Andover. So I think it's pretty cool that here today, so many years later, that when we go for a nice walk, we're walking where people walked for actually 11,000 years, because Ipswich has the oldest Paleo Indian site in this part of North America. So thank you for going on our walk today.